Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Effective Utility Management Roadmap. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a minute or two as more people are logging in, but thank you for joining us.
So I'm still here, Tori.
All right, thanks, Jim. We're going to get it situated in the background.
Tori?
Yes, Jim, we're still working on it.
I understand that. You just got a message from a guy named Daniel in Wichita.
Oh, thank you so much for that.
He's looking for the link to join the webinar.
Over 200 participants and rising.
Hello, everyone. Again, welcome to the Effective Utility Management Roadmap webinar. We're just waiting for people to join in, but thank you for joining us, and we'll get started here in a minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to the Effective Utility Management Roadmap webinar, The Road to Sustainability for Water and Wastewater Utilities. We're having little difficulties and Jim is unable to see the screen, so apologize, Jim, but we're working that on the back end right now. But thank you all for joining and thank you all for taking time out of your hectic schedules to join us and to learn more about the EUM roadmap. We're very excited today to share some of our knowledge and to answer any questions that you have today. And before we get started with the presentations, I just wanted to go over a couple webinar logistics. First, this webinar is being recorded. So if you have to jump off early, no worries. We'll be sending a webinar recording and a copy of the slides after the webinar. Participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you do have any questions, and we encourage you to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function that's down below in that red box. We'll be monitoring these questions and respond to as many as possible during the Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. If you happen to have any logistical questions, anything like that, please use the chat function and we'll try to stay up to date with that as possible. And to get a sense of who we have in the audience, we have a couple of questions for everyone. And you should see a box pop up on your screen. The first question that we have is, please indicate the sector that you work in. We have utility, state or local government, federal government, consultant, academia / educator, and other. And if you wouldn't mind just putting in your answer. And the second question that we have is, please indicate the type of utility and community size you work for. And with this answer, you can click multiple options. So let's say you are in drinking water and work in a small community, you can click on those two boxes. And I'm just gonna give people a couple seconds as they put in their answers. And if you aren't seeing the polling box, you can also chat in your answer as well. And I'll give everyone about 5 more seconds. All right, thank you everyone. And that's gonna share the results. And Jim, I'm so sorry that we're unable to see the screen right now, but in terms of our audience, we have 31% of our audience is in the utility, 38% are in state and local government, 19% are consultants, and then in terms of type of utility, we have 25% are in drinking water, 45% are in wastewater, 36% are combined, and we have 16% are in a small community between 1,000 to 10,000 people. 24% are in a medium community from 10,001 to 150,000, and the large community of 150,000 and more. And we have 14% that are in others. All right, thank you so much. And we just have one more question after this. And this is just for us to know, how have you engaged with EUM prior to this webinar? And you should see a polling box on your screen. If you don't see that, you can also chat that in as well. And so we have, have you engaged with EUM? Not at all, a little, attended an EUM workshop or presentation at a conference, or incorporated EUM into the organization. And I'll give everyone a couple seconds to answer that. And I'll give everyone 5 more seconds. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone. I'm gonna end the polling right now. And Jim, just to let you know that we have 49% of our audience have not engaged with EUM prior to this webinar. 21% have engaged a little. 22% have attended an EUM workshop or presentation at a conference, and 12% have incorporated EUM into organization. So we're very excited for the 49% of you that have not engaged with EUM prior to this webinar. We're excited to share our knowledge and hope that this will help you in your different positions. All right, thank you everyone. And Jim, I just wanted to let you know that the participants can see my screen. So as you talk through, they'll be able to see the slides that we have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tori.
All right. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Horn at EPA.
Hi, everybody. And thanks again for joining the webinar. Sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties on my end, but I've got all the slides we're going to be using today in front of me. So again, this is more about me than it is you. So thanks again very much for joining, and thanks again for responding to the poll. Very interesting responses. Again, my name is Jim Horn. I'm the Sustainable Utilities Program Manager. I'm with the Office of Wastewater Management at US EPA. And I've been promoting and advocating and educating people about EUM for about the last 12 years. So before I give my remarks, a little bit of background on the whole effort, I just want to identify again who is on the call with us today, and you'll be hearing their voices throughout the webinar. And I can't say how happy I am to be involved with all of these people. Ed McCormick is with McCormick Strategic Water Management, formerly with East Bay Mud in Oakland, California, a longtime ally and friend, and now works for our team, is one of our instructors on EUM. Rob Greenwood, been my partner for about the last 20 years on a whole number of projects, and both Ed and Rob were sort of the president of the creation, along with me, as the entire EUM framework that we'll be talking about here today was put together and recently updated. And so great to be working with them on so many different things. And then finally, last but by no means least, maybe first, is Tori Bahe with Roth Strategic, who is the person you've been hearing for the last few minutes. Tori has joined our team in about the last 6 or 8 months. And Tori, I just can't thank you enough for everything you're doing, not just this webinar, but everything you're doing on so many projects that we're involved in. And so Tori has been responsible for helping to set up the webinar and will help with the facilitation. So Tori, again, thanks for everything you do every day to make our team strong. I really appreciate it. So if we could go to the next, you're welcome. Let's go to the next slide. That's slide 8 for me. So what I'm showing you is not the document that we're going to be talking from here today, but it is a document that you should be aware of, especially the 49%, or is it 49 or 51% that are not really familiar with EUM, because this is the base document from which everything else is derived, including the roadmap that we'll be talking about throughout this webinar. This is what we call the EUM primer. This is the document that was put together by a group of utility leaders from around the country with support from EPA and all of the professional associations whose logos you saw on the first slide of the webinar. This is the base document, kind of the go-to document that takes you through how to do kind of the initial kind of basic assessment of your strengths and weaknesses based on what we call a series of attributes of an effectively managed utility. And so it is a very important document, again, a great starting point. It's certainly not our intention today to go through that in detail, but we will be happy to send you more information about this, including information about a series of workshops that we've been doing around the country to basically introduce utilities to the primer, and some of the stuff we'll be talking about today. So Tori will share that information after the webinar today to let you know where we've been and where we're going to be going in the next 4 to 5, 6, 8 months. I said 4 to 5, I guess I should modify that, shouldn't I? Probably more in the next 8 to 9 months, because like everybody else, we've had a little bit of a slowdown because of the pandemic. But those workshops are great. If you're interested, please let us know, and we'll be happy to provide you more information about the workshops as they take place. So next slide, Tori.
All right, next slide.
Okay, so on this slide, you see 2 documents. The first document is the one I talked about a few minutes ago, which is the primer, which is kind of the starting point, the initial kind of assessment of your utility's strengths and weaknesses based on these attributes. And that leads to basically what we call the roadmap document, which you see on the right-hand side. The roadmap is kind of EUM, I guess, 201, if you will. It really is intended to allow you to take the results of your initial assessment that you do under the primer and then go the next step further and really start to drill down and say, okay, where do I stand in terms of my implementation of specific practices, individual practices, all organized around each of the 10 attributes. And you're going to learn more about that a lot today from both Rob and Ed. But it really is kind of the next step that allows you to take that next level of detail. Both documents were put together really by work groups that we chaired of utility leaders from around the country. And as you hear more about the roadmap and you see the document and hopefully are able to read it in more detail when you can, those are all actual utility management practices that utilities around the country are implementing. We don't necessarily call them best practices, but they are practices that are in place and that a group of utility leaders from around the country thought were important to put in a document like the roadmap to help you as you use it in your own organization. So on to slide 10, please, Tori.
All right, got it.
The roadmap itself was actually released back in 2013. As I said, it really builds on the EUM primer. Developed a lot, well, not a lot, very heavily with the input by utility managers that we selected from around the country, and were obviously, and also were nominated by our association partners. We also did what we call a road testing exercise, where once we had the document in a draft form, we asked 4 or 5 of those utilities to test it back at their utility, made some revisions based on that test, and basically the updated version was released back in 2018 based on the road test. And again, it's used to inform and take you through the next steps in terms of level of detail to the that derive from the EUM primer that I spoke about. And so one document leads to the other, if you will, very much, and that's really the purpose for today's webinar, why we wanted to talk to you. So let me just pause here a minute and say, these are observations that I've seen after having been involved in this for about the last 7 or 8 years. And this is about EUM in general, the whole basis of the program, again, being with these 10 attributes of effectively managed utilities, which we'll describe in a little more detail, but certainly you should take a look at in the primer document. And so it's always useful to say, well, what's the benefit? What are people saying that have implemented this around the country? And the message has been really clear. It saves you money. Implementing or basing your utilities management program around this framework can help you save money by really helping you to optimize the planning and delivery of your services. It can help you ensure a reliable source of water consistent with customer needs. These are not just phrases that I'm making up for a slide. These are things that we hear back. Use energy and water efficient practices and technology that can help foster reuse, resource recovery, and green infrastructure. Become more resilient to short-term disasters. And I think that's borne out, I think, by some of the feedback we've got recently about organizations that have used the EUM framework, but are also, like many of you on the webinar today, struggling with all of the resiliency needed to get through the pandemic, and the stories from utilities about the ways they've been doing that and the great work that demonstrates their resiliency are really, really important. And last, but certainly not least in terms of benefits from my point of view, is this is intended to be a very open and transparent process that you use as you go through the assessment, through the primer, and then in more detail, as we will describe through the roadmap on today's webinar. It really helps you build greater understanding and support from decision-making bodies, customers, and other stakeholders. I think as everybody realizes, the utility sector, the water utility sector, really is in a very different sort of state of being than it was maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where now public engagement in building this continued support from a range of not just customers, but other stakeholders, decision makers, people in your community, if you will, is really critical to your success. In this process, this EUM approach is proven time and time again to be a great way to build that kind of confidence through not only how you operate, but how you can demonstrate to the public that you are aware of the issues that are of concern to them and are building that into your own thinking every single day. So I'd just like to say again, thanks very much. It's a delight for EPA to be able to sponsor this webinar. We're going to have another one in a couple of months, and I'd certainly appreciate it if you like what you hear today to recommend this to your colleagues or anybody else that you come in contact with. We really enjoy providing this kind of information. And as Tori has said, all the information in terms of the slides, and the recorded version of the webinar will be made available shortly after we conclude. So let me just stop there and say thank you again and pass it off to our next speaker, which I think will be Ed. Again, thanks, Ed, so much for being part of the team, and glad to hear from you today.
Great. Jim, thanks very much.
That's not Ed, that's Rob, but that's okay. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Jim. Thanks very much. Yeah, Rob Greenwood from Ross Strategic. Thanks very much to all of you for joining today. We're running at about 285 participants for the webinar, so great participation. For this part of the webinar, I'm going to provide an overview of the roadmap document and sort of walk you through the process that's been laid out as part of the roadmap. And then from there, I'll turn things over to Ed McCormick, and Ed will take you through some of the experience that he's had working with utilities in the context of workshops and other contexts to talk about how utilities have actually utilized the roadmap to support their planning efforts. So next slide, please. Terrific. So first, again, just to let you know how the webinar will proceed from here. The overview of EUM and the overview of the EUM roadmap. Jim has already covered a bit of both of these topics. I'll get a little more granular. Then we'll move into implementation experience. Again, Ed McCormick will handle that, and then we should have plenty of time for question and answer period at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. In terms of, okay, I'm seeing some people chat in that the sound has been lost for some people. Others are saying that they can hear, so that may be a local problem. I'll just ask those that are on the technical back end if you could take a look at that. Thanks very much. Again, I'm seeing a lot of chats in that people still have sound. So I'll keep going at this point. So in terms of our objectives today, we're going to describe ways that the UN roadmap can be used. So really help you as participants initiate use of the roadmap at your utility, and then help you there through that assess utility conditions and track progress of your improvements. And then finally, learn from examples of utility peers that have used the roadmap. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, go ahead to the next slide. Thanks very much. So Jim has already mentioned the EUM primer. This represents what is the information at the center of the EUM primer. And what you'll see here around the outer ring are the 5 keys to management success that are identified in the EUM primer. So it's covering leadership, strategic business planning, knowledge management, measurement, and continual improvement. So those are known as the 5 keys to management success presented in the primer. For the next concentric circle in, you'll see what are the 10 attributes. Jim mentioned the 10 attributes of effective utility management. And what these are designed to do is to cover the full landscape that a utility needs to plan and manage for to be overall effective. So we have product quality, customer satisfaction, employee and leadership development, operational optimization, financial viability, infrastructure strategy and performance, enterprise resiliency, community sustainability, water resource sustainability, and stakeholder understanding and support. Within the context of the EUM primer document and the workshops that Jim mentioned that have been going on around the country, there's a self-assessment exercise that utilities move through and identify which of the 10 attributes are most in a position to receive attention by the utility to improve overall effective utility management. So the output of using the EUM primer is typically anywhere between 1 and 3 attributes that the utility would like to focus on going forward to improve its overall management. So for example, the utility might identify financial viability, product quality, and enterprise resiliency as 3 key areas that they would like to work on. Next slide, please. So the concept of the roadmap is that once those areas have been identified, those 3 of the 10 areas have been identified, that the roadmap then provides examples of effective practices to help the utility plan at a more granular level around those 3 areas of improvement that they'd like to undertake. In one way to think about this, if you look at this continual improvement cycle that's represented on the slide, the self-assessment up in the upper right hand there of the cycle is a self-assessment conducted through use of the EUM primer. Those results can feed into strategic business planning, and there are utilities around the country that have just adopted the 10 attributes as their framework for their strategic business planning. When you move towards the roadmap, you're starting to move more into what some utilities would look at as their annual business planning cycle, where they're looking to identify very specific activities that they'll engage in over the next 12 months and that they need to budget for. So as part of their annual business planning, including their budgeting, the roadmap can support identifying practices that the utility would like to implement. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is, having sort of set up the background on a little more granular relationship between the EUM primer and the 10 attributes, and then moving to the roadmap, I'd like to dig down into more of the specifics of the roadmap. So the first thing to understand about the roadmap is that the 10 attributes and 5 keys to management success that are within the EUM primer have been combined and organized within the roadmap to efficiently present example practices. So what you'll see on the extreme left of this slide are 2 of the keys to management success: utility business planning and leadership. And if you look all the way over to the right-hand side, again under keys to management success, you'll see the other 3 keys: measurement, continual improvement management, and knowledge management. So if you want to, again, you can sort of think about this as utility business planning and leadership over on the left-hand side as filtered through the EUM attributes, and on the back end, the use of measurement, continual improvement management, and knowledge management to support the whole system. In the center, under EUM attributes, what you'll see here is that there are 8 line items identified. The first 2 represent a combination of 2 attributes. So we have first product quality and operational optimization that have been combined for purposes of presentation in the roadmap. Second, we have customer satisfaction and stakeholder understanding and support. Again, those 2 are 2 attributes that have been combined. The reason for combining attributes is that as the work was being undertaken with the utility managers to develop the roadmap, what we were consistently finding was an overlap in the effective practices between these attribute areas. So for product quality and operational optimization, we kept seeing an overlap in the effective practices. And so to avoid that redundancy, we merged the attributes for purposes of presentation in the roadmap. Okay, next slide, please. The other key framing aspect of the roadmap is its use or identification of 3 business levels. When the roadmap was in development, it was recognized that effective practice is very much tied to what is the strategic orientation, strategic business orientation that the utility has adopted for itself. So these three levels represent a progression of utility management. But what they don't represent is any particular sort of preference or advocacy on the part of those that contributed to producing the roadmap. Each of these levels are recognized as fully appropriate for certain utility contexts. So the first business level is providing adequate fundamental services. Think about this as the utility that is just very, very focused on making sure that it has a reliable system, a resilient system, a system that's consistently in compliance and is consistently meeting its local customer needs. So it is a well-run utility delivering on the fundamental service of drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater. Level 2 business strategy is optimizing operations and services. This is the utility that has decided from a strategic business standpoint that it's advantageous to it to move into a continual improvement mode or stance. So this utility is sort of implementing on an ongoing basis the ability to understand how its various practices and operations are running. It's collecting data, it's analyzing that data, and using that to improve continually over time. So again, a shift there, and often that's driven by a high interest in improved efficiency and improved effectiveness, and in part may be in response to elevated customer and community expectations for the performance that the utility will deliver over time. The level 3 business strategy, referred to here as transforming operations and services for the future, relates to the utility that again has made the strategic business decision that it wants to very much sort of push outward from the core services that the utility delivers. Here, what I think of is the Utility of the Future program that's been stood up by the Water Environment Federation, NACWA, and other national associations that's designed to recognize utilities that are transforming their services and are very focused on being a community resource recovery facility, a community resource recovery asset. So again, this is the real transformational thinking. As I've already mentioned, again, each one of these levels are considered fully appropriate depending on different utility operating contexts. But what the roadmap does is provide an opportunity for a utility to say, you know, we're currently, our business strategy, either explicit or implicit in how we've been running our utility, has been to provide adequate fundamental services. But we might be interested in advancing our management, given how conditions might be altering for our operations. And so what the roadmap does is allow the utility to look into effective practices for level 2 or for level 3. So there's a potential progression that a utility could decide to follow. Another thing to note about these business levels is that utilities may be in one attribute area, may be focused on providing adequate fundamental services, while in a separate attribute area may be moving out on, you know, all the way up to transforming operations and services for the future. So each of the management areas and attributes that are addressed in the roadmap acknowledge that there could be differences in terms of how the utility has decided to position itself from an overall business strategy standpoint. Now, I will just say that in the actual roadmap document, if you go to page 6 of that document, these business levels are described in more detail. I also just wanted to mention there was a question chatted in earlier about the availability of the EUM primer as well as the roadmap document. if you Google either of those documents, it'll pop right up. Both are available on EPA's website. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide gives a representation of, as you move in deeper to the roadmap document, what you'll find under each of the management areas. So let me go ahead and just sort of step you through how the framing or framework here works, and then I'll take you through the more sort of specifics of the self-assessment steps that are recommended within and the roadmap is designed to support. So the first thing you'll see at the top here is management area title. So this particular screenshot is focused on the employee and leadership development attribute. So again, as I said, each of the attributes in the management areas have their own section of the roadmap. So here that you would encounter this page just as you start into the employee and leadership development attribute. So management area title, employee and leadership development. The next thing you'll encounter is a definition of the scope of this management area. So for employee leadership and development, the scope that's listed here is this management area includes organizational structure, workplace culture, institutional knowledge, succession planning, and employee development opportunities. So again, the scope of what the roadmap will be covering is defined there. And this, again, these scope statements appear for each of the attributes and management areas within the roadmap. The next thing you'll encounter is the business level. And the first business level that you would encounter is level 1, and then level 2 and level 3 would be deeper in the text in the roadmap. So again, level 1, as we've already said, is defined as providing adequate fundamental services. The next thing you'll encounter is a practice statement. And here, there's a relationship between the number of practice statements that will appear under each level, under each management area, based on the scope statement. So what you'll note is in the management area scope statement above, it says that this management area includes organizational structure, workplace culture. So what you'll see here is a practice statement for workplace culture. So it says clarity is established for all job responsibilities and functions. Sufficient workforce with necessary training is in place in all staff functions. So that's the practice statement for workforce culture at level 1 under employee leadership and development. Now, one thing that I'll note is that these practice statements for example, for workplace culture evolve as you move to level 2 and you move to level 3. So they become more expansive and more forward-looking as you move to level 2 and level 3. Now, the final thing you'll see then is example practices. So example practices are listed, and these example practices are designed to be reflective of the management area, of the business level that we're working with, and specifically tied to advancing workplace culture. Now, one thing I'd like to stress is these are example practices. They are not best practices. They are not recommended practices. They're practices that were accumulated from utility managers around the country that they said, these are practices that we have found can be effective. And so it's a collection of examples. And these examples are designed to help you create an internal dialogue and exploration with your staff teams. And so again, the idea here is that these are sort of ideas for you to consider. Many utilities will find that they already have these in place. Others will find examples that they had not yet implemented and may be appropriate for their circumstances. But again, the idea here is to have enough examples and solid examples to promote an effective dialogue within your utility. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the assessment process that's laid out in the roadmap and is very much tied to this notion of evaluating your current state of practices related to the management area and a particular business level. So it takes you through a 5-step process. First, assess your current activity relative to each example practice, then determine what action that you'd like to take. Step 3, add any alternative practices, draw a conclusion about the practice statement, and then finally, at the end, make some notes as needed to help with your implementation. And I'll take you through each one of these steps on the next few slides. So next slide, please. Okay, so again, what you'll encounter within the roadmap is a listing of example practices. Again, as I said, they're tied to the management area, they're tied to the level of implementation, as well as certain aspects of the scope of the statement that's produced under each one. So the first thing that you'll do is you'll have these example practices that are listed. And in this case, tied back to employee leadership and development, we have the example practice, written job requirements and descriptions for all staff functions. So the first thing that you're asked to do is to just do a basic assessment. Do we have it? So maybe you don't, so you would check don't have. We're in progress. So this is something that we have started to implement, but we haven't yet completed. And the final one, this is a practice that we've fully implemented and it's complete. So it's just a basic assessment. Do we have it or not? Are we already in progress? Have we completed bringing this practice into our utility? Next slide, please. The next step then is to determine what action you would like to take as a utility relative to each of the example practices. And here there are 3 options. You can say, okay, let's adopt this. So maybe you've indicated that you don't have it. You discuss among a team that's been assembled. The decision is made that this is a practice that you'd like to implement. So bang, you check adopt. Maybe you're in progress, and so you decide that you want to improve. And then finally, maybe it's complete and you want to maintain it. Maybe you don't have it and you've decided that you don't want to implement it. That also would then receive a maintain. We'll stay with our current status quo relative to the practice. Next slide, please. There's also the availability or space available to provide alternative or additional practices. What we've typically found working with utilities on this is, one, the utilities may have other practices in place other than the examples that are provided that they feel very good about and want to retain those. So those practices would get written in, and there'd be an indication of, for example, that the practice is completely implemented and that you would like to maintain it. Or there may be alternative practices that you currently don't have, but as part of this exercise and brainstorming that's going on among the team, you decide that you want to bring into the utility and implement. So again, you can add that practice. Next step. So finally, at the end, you would draw a conclusion for each practice statement and decide green, like, yep, we're in great shape. We're just going to continue doing what we've been doing. We're feeling good about that. Yellow as an indication that there's some work we'd like to do, but we feel overall we're in a pretty good place. And red, which is, gee, having gone through the exercise of looking at example practices, we feel like we're pretty deficient in terms of where we'd like to be. So an indication of red. And then finally, we'll go to the next slide for step 5. And then there's a place where you can put in any notes that you think will be helpful, particularly in supporting implementation moving forward. So there's some prompting questions there. You know, why did I select the practice statement conclusion? What's the, what's the decision between, one conclusion and another? What level of implementation does my utility want to be at for the given attribute? And is my utility close to meeting that goal? So again, it's just an opportunity to provide some reflections that, again, can be helpful as you move forward with implementation. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what I'd like to do now is turn things over to Ed McCormick to talk about implementation experience, utility implementation experience with the roadmap. Thanks very much, and Ed, I'll turn things over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. Greetings all. Rob did a really nice job of giving that overview of the EUM process, as well as the roadmap and effective practices. One of the things that I really love about this whole process is that it's very flexible in that it's scalable from small utilities to larger utilities, but it's also very simple. As a past utility manager, what I always found was, whether it's going to a conference or a workshop or a webinar like this, you really want to come away with one or two great ideas to put to work for you to help improve your organization. A little bit about my background. The vast majority of my career was as a utility manager from small, mid-size, and mostly large combined water, wastewater utilities in California. I probably know many of you, though, through my work with the Water Environment Federation or the Water Research Foundation. Collectively, I spent about a decade on those boards and got around to probably most states in the country, talking about things like effective utility management and such. So again, as we move now into this implementation experience portion, just to give you a sense that my perspective comes from somebody that in leading utility, we all have so many things to focus on day to day, but the key is having a sort of a continual improvement process in place so that you don't get lost in the details of the day-to-day decisions of running a utility, that you're not also focused on what are the 2 or 3 key areas that you want to focus long-term improvement for your organization on. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. There we go. We talked a bit about roadmap case studies, and this is something that EPA has been a huge supporter of the water sector on. And what was, there were really 5 leading U.S. utilities that road tested the roadmap. The case studies were initially published in 2016, and then they informed EPA's 2018 update of the roadmap. And you can see there from a variety of utilities around the country, from small to large: Charlotte Water, Clean Water Services out in Oregon, Greenwood Metropolitan, a small district down in South Carolina, New Water over in Green Bay, the city of Green Bay. In fact, that was probably one of the first that I recall rebranding around water resource recovery of utilities around the country. It's probably over a decade now. And then Palm Bay Utilities down in Florida. So this is a very useful document to take a look at because we did want to sort of road test how this process worked in a variety of utilities. Let's face it, it's not one case fits all. That's why Rob mentioned you can even, you can get to the point where some attributes you want to be operating at a level 1, whereas there's 1 or 2 attributes that are so critical to your organization and the community that you serve that you decide to take it to a level 2 or a level 3 operation over the course of time. So, moving forward. There we go. Okay. How utilities are using the roadmap to create an improvement action plan. So the real key to follow through on a continual improvement program is really developing an improvement action plan. and you want to build on the results of that EUM self-assessment. Most utilities often find that it's most effective to select their 1 or 2 highest priority attribute areas from the self-assessment to focus your improvement action planning on. And although there are 10 attributes, when you go through the process of a self-assessment very quickly, we found, and Rob and I and Jim, we've done about 15 of these effective utility management workshops all around the country over the past 3 years. Inevitably, what utilities start to find is that they can get their best bang for the buck in the areas that are most important, that also are the ones that most need improvement in their organization. And so again, that principle, the EUM principle of kind of keeping it simple, focus on the most important, highest priority attribute areas. Let's see, there we go. So the roadmap, what it does, as Rob mentioned, is it helps utilities identify effective practices to adopt as part of your action plan. And as he mentioned, some may be brand new to you, and whether it be at a workshop where you learn new practices across the table from just some of the other folks there, or you're looking at the roadmap and you're finding attribute by attribute various effective practices, some of which may quickly appeal to your organization of things that you may want to put in place. Some you may already have in place, and you may decide that you really want to increase your focus or perhaps enhance the practice that's already in place to take it to another level. So across those various workshops that we have done over the years, as well as just experience and myself having worked for small, mid-sized, and large utilities as general manager, as a deputy general manager, and as a senior manager, we found a number of there's a number of sort of commonly adopted effective practices that we see, and I'm going to just walk through a list of several for you. These are ones that continually we see these at a number of utilities, and as we engage with utilities, we find that these are some of the most common ones that the utilities decided we'd like to put that into place. And so this list shows a series of effective practices and also which attribute areas they reflect. So having standard operating procedures in place is one of those examples of very commonly adopted effective practices. These are so important. What I found when I went to work at a smaller utility was the importance of putting something like that into place that perhaps is more common at larger utilities with more employee turnover, larger staffs. But you can see how important that is particularly with the knowledge management, the need for that management area. So this standard operating procedures, and a lot of us think of those as being, your operating procedures for operating facilities. And absolutely that is the case, but it can also be expanded to be operating procedures in a number of the various areas, whether it be in the financial arena, in the human resources arena. Those can be very helpful. The attribute areas that this particular practice refers to is the employee and leadership development, but also the quality, product quality, and operational optimization. Another commonly adopted effective practice is actively seeking timely customer feedback on your utility service performance. And we're seeing this really over the past decade, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of utilities that are recognizing the importance of receiving and responding to customer feedback and engaging with their community. A third is setting predictable and adequate rates to support current needs and invest in future needs. This in the attribute area of financial viability. I think this is very important I think I'm preaching to the choir. I know I've worked with utility that prided itself on having, for example, no rate increases for many years. Well, at the end of the day, probably a very challenging thing to try to do, because your costs are going up every year, if only because of inflation, not to mention new regulations, whatever it may be. So the importance of setting these predictable, adequate rates to support not only your current needs, but to invest in your future. Some utilities do even 10-year capital planning, probably much more common as a 5-year plan. But again, the importance of having adequate rates in place for you to be able to be successful in those various attribute areas. Another is having an asset management program in place with your critical assets and remaining service life inventoried. For many, this is something that you've been doing for many years, if not decades. For others, it's something that you'd like to move into and enhance what you're currently doing. Perhaps you've got one in place for your collection systems, but perhaps not for your treatment facilities. So this is the attribute area for this commonly adopted effective practice is infrastructure strategy and performance. Again, I'm giving some examples of ones that we've seen commonly adopted and utilized by a broad cross-section, and these are generally scalable from small utilities up to large utilities. The last one I'm showing here is efficiently utilizes water and energy resources. This is the area of operational optimization. Reducing your water footprint, your energy footprint, and the costs that are associated with both of those. So it's also community sustainability and financial viability. This is an area where utilities that want to move perhaps into a level 3 with respect to water resource recovery will also find, and the reason financial viability is there, not just the cost savings, but as you move into water resource recovery, you find the benefits of bringing in additional revenue streams for things that we used to view as waste, but now they're being used to produce renewable energy. They're being used for recovering other resources, not only water reuse, but also biosolids reuse. Whoops, I actually had a sixth. So the sixth one was one that we're seeing pretty frequently now, utilizes life cycle cost and triple bottom line analysis in capital project decision-making. This covers a variety of attribute areas, but the three most relevant to this one is infrastructure strategy and performance, financial viability, and community sustainability. And not necessarily part of this webinar, but look out for one perhaps down the road. EPA has been supporting it's called AAA analysis, augmented alternatives analysis. It's a great new product, tool, I should say, for quantifying when we talk about triple bottom line. So not just the economics and environmental, but also social benefits of a project where you can now engage your community. What's really nice about that is it does allow you to identify, quantify things like social benefits and environmental benefits. It's always been easy for us, or easiest in our industry, with a traditional capital project decision-making process, to focus on economics alone. But I see this as being something that's already growing in our sector, and you'll probably see more and more of this as we get more engaged communities that want to play a role and at least have an influence on how their rates are being utilized. So we've talked about the implementation of effective practices that rolled out of strategic planning and business planning, which rolled out of the self-assessment. This is really, if you've seen it, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, continual improvement cycle is really what this is, the EUM cycle. And as Rob mentioned, a number of you, it could be that your self-assessment flows into a strategic business planning process, or perhaps your annual budgeting process. And then from there, as we just talked about, implementing effective practices. So now the key is, how well are we doing with those effective practices? And measurement becomes very critical in a way, you know, unless, in fact, we'll go to the next slide. There we go. So why is performance measurement so critical for utilities? Peter Drucker, a management guru from back 70s, 80s into the 90s, he stated, what's measured improves. And the corollary that our industry is, you really can't improve what you don't measure. I think we've heard that quite a bit. And in a way, it's true. If you're not focused on something, if you can't measure an improvement, it's very difficult to determine whether or not you are improving in a particular performance area. The roadmap does a really nice job of giving example performance measures by attribute for you to measure your success. And those performance measures, if you look to the roadmap, you just go attribute by attribute, and there are numerous examples of different quantitative measures. And as I mentioned earlier, social benefits are often the most challenging. So when it comes to some of the more often subjective attributes, it's very helpful to have the benefit of a number of utility leaders from around the North America that have come together to find ways to quantify performance measures. So here's an example. If you go to the, I think it's Appendix C of the roadmap, this is what you will see. It's really a description and a formulation for the measures. This example is for customer complaints under this customer satisfaction attribute. So the way it reads is, for each of these attributes, there's a series. This is number one, customer complaints. It describes what that means. It kind of defines customer complaints. Then goes on to list a number, and this just shows a couple of them, of examples of ways to determine customer complaints. And then perhaps your measure might be perhaps a goal that you've established for your organization is to reduce by X% or reduce by a certain number over the course of a year, or of course over a 5-year plan. So I'm going to move to the next slide and talk a bit about some of the more commonly adopted utility performance measures. I personally utilize all of these, but I've also seen them utilized in many utilities. And I'm going to show you 5 examples for these. The first, you probably all seen this, number of sanitary sewer overflows per 1,000 miles of pipe per year. And the attribute area here is with respect to product quality. Now, looking at the employee and leadership development attribute area, things such as employee turnover rate, employee job satisfaction, percent of positions filled with internal candidates, all 3 of these. And you may ask, gee, how do you get your hands around employee job satisfaction? And that's probably the topic of another webinar. You could do a whole webinar just on that. But obviously, needing to be reaching out and having listening sessions with your employees and finding ways to quantify that is helpful, because over the course of time, you do want to keep your hand on the pulse of your organization. And issues like morale are very difficult to get your hands around. A planned maintenance ratio is an example of a commonly adopted utility performance measure. This being the ratio of planned versus reactive maintenance. And obviously the higher, the more of your time spent proactively avoiding maintenance headaches and problems, the better, the more cost effective for you. And so we found that planned maintenance ratio is something that's very quickly over the past decade come into play as an important measure for many, many utilities from small to large. Rate affordability is another example. Also, things such as the cost per millions of gallons of water produced or wastewater treated. And the attribute areas that these would reflect would be enterprise resiliency, financial viability, community sustainability. And even within the topic of affordability, you can get even more granular. Is it average affordability, or is it at the family level, which is where a lot of utilities now are starting to focus? And then the final example of a commonly adopted utility performance measure being percent of energy demand met by the utility's renewable energy generation. This plays to utilities that really want to move towards the future of not only meeting their own energy demand and having that reliability in the case of utility outages, but also decreasing the amount of energy that must be purchased from others in order to run an operation. Energy being one of the, after staff, energy being perhaps the highest cost for area for many, many utilities out there. This one ties to community sustainability and obviously financial viability. So these are some examples. There are obviously many others, and as I mentioned earlier, there's no such thing. One case does not fit all. Every utility has a different situation. When we don't talk a whole lot about water reuse when we're in parts of the, around the Great Lakes or perhaps even up into New England, although that's changing as well. Whereas in my neck of the woods out here in the dry Southwest, where people are still fighting to get more water, that becomes, water reuse becomes a very high priority. So it's certainly not one case fits all, and something to keep in mind. But I think the roadmap does a great job of providing that flexibility so that you can benefit from many, many other utilities that have identified practices that they found effective. And as Rob mentioned, we've been moving away from using the term best practices now in the sector for some time because of that fact that what might be a best practice for one organization in one part of the country in one particular region or political situation may not be a best practice for others. So we've been using effective practices as the new terminology. So next, I'm going to talk a bit about utility action planning before we turn it over, open it up for question and answers. And there are obviously many ways to do utility action planning. But there are some, sort of common approaches and sequences that make a lot of sense. And here's one that we'll throw out as an example that we found effective. And you may have approaches just as more effective. The implement approach is a step. Identifying, for example, if you end up selecting 2 or 3 attribute areas or practices that you want to put into place, having somebody as a champion. I'm a big proponent of the project management approach. If needing to have somebody accountable. So when we talk about action planning, who is going to do what by when? And if you form a team but have somebody as a champion for that attribute or for that improvement area, I think you've got a really strong start towards making sure that that happens. The second, a little bit of delay on.
This is going to be better.
There we go. So next is performing the self-assessment using the EUM primer, as walked you through. And that's important, identifying where you're strong, where there's areas where you can improve, which are most critical for you, short-term, long-term, and which are less critical for you moving forward. So once you finish that self-assessment, then the third step
Hey, Ed. I think your audio is cutting in and out. I'm not sure if you've moved away from the speaker or anything, but we just wanted to note that we're having a little bit of a difficulty listening to you.
No, I haven't, but I will try to be a little louder. I'm having a little difficulty moving my animation forward. Maybe I'll move that back to Turi and let you forward them. Okay, third one. Third step, identify top 1 or 2 priority attribute areas for improvement. Certainly, there are some utilities in case studies that have moved forward on 3 or more. What we found is, again, with the principle of keeping it simple. If you pick 1 or 2 priority attribute areas for improvement and really focus on those, then once you've achieved success via your performance measures, you can always then move to a 3rd or perhaps over time a 4th attribute area. So this is an approach that we recommend in your utility action planning, is start with 1 or 2 attribute areas. Next, conducting your roadmap assessment. Adopt and update your utility's effective practices in the highest priority attribute areas. And a number of utilities may have those worked into a strategic plan. Some would have them actually write in employee performance plans so that it becomes pretty clear, and it helps you get alignment between what your employees are doing on a day-to-day basis for your organization with what's actually in your strategic plan all the way up to your mission, so that again, updating your effective practices in each of those areas. Then moving on to the 5th. Next is establishing performance measures to assess progress. And I gave a number of examples of performance measures. And I'm sure many of you have performance measures in place. So item 6. Oftentimes, particularly if it starts to get to where you have many performance measures in place and you want to assess progress, is creating a performance dashboard, keeping it relatively simple and visual, something that you can use both within your organization, but also when you roll it up to a high level to report to your respective board or city council or county board of supervisors. So again, it's implementing the adopted practices in creating that performance dashboard. 7th step, to incorporate action plan items. These are the new and updated practices right into your annual budget or operating plan. And I know a number of organizations out there, and 2 of the 3 I worked at actually had biannual budgets. So we would do a 2-year budget. We would do a sort of a tweaking in the off year, and then a significant effort every other year. But the importance of getting your new and updated practices incorporated into your budget, so you've got the resources in place in the budget document approved by your elected officials to help engage moving your organization forward on those practices. And then finally is tracking the results. That will inform your utility's continual improvement effort and help you then, when you get to that cycle diagram that we showed, allow you to then make changes and tweaks based on your results to further improve, take your organization to the next level. So with that, I'm going to slide it back over to Turi, who is going to facilitate and lead the question and answer period for y'all. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ed. Thank you everyone for staying on, and we know that there are a number of questions. If you do have any questions, we would ask that you please submit your question using the Q&A function. We've had a couple of questions come in and a couple of questions come in from the chat, but if you're able to put it in the Q&A box, that makes it a lot easier for us to track everything. So thank you so much. So if you do have any questions, I recommend that you type them in right now. And Rob, we did have a couple questions come in the chat, and I'm happy to read the first one out.
That sounds great, Tori. Please do.
All right. The first question that we have is, does the roadmap, primer, and the effort also take into account the areas of emergency management, security management, response, and recovery?
So the answer is yes. And that actually starts with the EUM primer, as Jim Horn referred to it as sort of the sort of core document. It's the enterprise resiliency area attribute. And then that enterprise resiliency attribute carries forward into the roadmap. And what you'll find there then is laid out a succession of practices related to each of the business levels that I previously mentioned.
All right, thank you, Rob. And does Jim or Ed have any other response to that? I can move on to the second question as well.
I think Rob covered that pretty well. It really is right there at the heart of enterprise resiliency.
All right, thank you all. Our second question that we have is, based on those 3 business levels, the preparation for climate change, would that be a level 3 effort?
So, Tori, with respect to that, and again, so let's first talk about climate adaptation. Climate adaptation is both implicit and explicitly built into the enterprise resiliency area within the roadmap. What readers will find under enterprise resiliency is a progression from business levels 1, 2, and up to 3 of the sort of the sophistication of the vulnerability assessment that's undertaken at the utility, the type of emergency response planning and consequence management that a utility engages in, and finally, the nature of the resilience investments that are considered and undertaken. So implicit in the progression from 1 to 2 to 3 is getting into different types of vulnerabilities or risks that a utility may be subjected to. So as early as level 1, but certainly by a level 2 business area, for certain utilities that are in areas where climate-related risks are significant, those would come into play. And then what I'll mention is that it is, in fact, at level 3 that there's a specific call out of a climate adaptation plan has been prepared. And just you can note, enterprise resiliency is the number 7 attribute that's addressed in the roadmap, and that particular practice is 7.3.3.5. So you can specifically find that called out.
Thank you, Rob.
And if I could just add to that.
Oh, yes, absolutely, Ed.
The other thing we're finding is that in recent years that enterprise resiliency is becoming really an attribute with some significant focus. There are some utilities that are, whether it's having unusually severe storm events that used to happen once in 100 years, now they're happening 3-4 times in a 3, 4, 5-year period. Whether it's drought that's adversely impacting their ability to provide services. In some cases, sea level rise that's gotten to the point where saltwater intrusion is significantly filling collection systems. So again, it's some utilities are much more adversely impacted, but what we are finding that really over the past 5 years, enterprise resiliency has been coming up more and more significantly.
All right, thank you, Ed. And the next question along the lines of the business levels, someone asked, are the business level existing or what you aspire to?
Yeah, if I could take a shot at that. It's both. It really is both. So that the key is selecting what you actually aspire to, because as part of this continual improvement cycle, you want to know what your target is. But it's also nice to know what your baseline is, so you can identify where you are currently. If you're a 1, and if you got 10 attributes and you're at level 1 for all 10 attributes, and you may choose that for 8 of those attributes, the best place for your organization to be is as a 1, but perhaps for 1 or 2 of those attributes, you may want to have your stretch goal to be, these are the 2 attributes where we need to be at the 2 or even 3 level. So to answer that question, it's actually both, knowing where you are today and then where you want to get to.
All right, thank you, Ed. And our next question that we have is, within a utility, who self-assesses and decides attribute priorities? Is that the individual, or is that a committee or work group?
So what I've seen is a variety of sometimes it decides on size of an organization, but not necessarily. There are larger utilities that have had, I hate to use the term survey, but they have, send out questionnaires to employees. There are others where you have the leadership team. I think that's probably more common, the leadership team of an organization. We've been involved in organizations that engaged outside of their organization, even to a community member or 2. Elected officials can participate as well. So I guess, for the culture of your organization, you decide what's the most appropriate level to do that at. I would say the most common that I've seen, and I really would ask, Rob and Jim to weigh in as well, is more commonly, it's often the leadership team, but with some level of engagement from the staff of the leadership team to make sure that they're weighing in and talking to folks that are on the front line that also understand certain things that sometimes the leadership may not be quite as aware of.
And Tori, this is Rob. I'll come in here as well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, just fully agree with Ed's characterization. The one thing I'll add is the most effective implementations I've seen has been a combination of a leadership team and then the leadership team sets up a cross-functional team, and then there's interplay between the leadership team and the cross-functional team. And the important aspect of the cross-functional team is that when you're getting into the self-assessment, both through the EUM primer and then the more granular assessment through the roadmap, you really are talking about a holistic look at the utility and its functions. And almost by definition, then it substantially benefits from a cross-functional team taking a look together, comparing notes, and advancing the assessment.
Yeah, the thing I found with the cross-functional team is pretty important. Is this is sometimes an opportunity for you to, if you've got emerging leaders in your organization, perhaps they're not part of your leadership team at all, but they do command the respect across the organization, from operations to engineering to the folks in the financial area. Sometimes you can identify a champion for a particular improvement area, and that individual operates in kind of that cross-functional area where they're working across the organization.
All right, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Rob. Another question that we have, which might be more in terms of creating a program, but the question is there perhaps a dashboard that can indicate in a screen where the utility is in the progress and where the utility is in progress and how much more to go in these different activities?
I'll start out with that one, and then Ed, come back around to you. So the roadmap was structured with the concept of dashboard in mind. So if you'll remember back to the slide that I presented, where I said, at the end of each level and practice statement, once you've examined your the practice situation at your utility, you can draw a conclusion of green, yellow, red, which is a sort of classic dashboard indicator. We don't have a dashboard template that supports the roadmap at this time. We have seen some of the utilities that implemented translate their results into a dashboard. If you look at the case examples that Ed mentioned previously, you'll see in there a couple of the utilities that did go to a dashboard format.
Right. That's what I was going to add, is that if you look at those 5 case studies, you'll see a couple where at least you would see example maps for that. In fact, perhaps it's supplementary, if there's a link that could be sent out to participants to the to the case studies, that might be helpful.
Great suggestion, Ed. Yes, after we are finished with this webinar, I will be sending out a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and then as Ed mentioned, I can also send a link to the case examples as well. Thank you for that reminder, Ed. And on that subject of case example, we have a question. The examples mentioned in application among other entities, is there a case study that identifies their challenges, what they implemented, and how they overcame these challenges?
Well, to some extent, I'll take a shot at that. To an extent, across those 5 case studies, there are a couple of examples where, because let's face it, the reality is that there's usually a challenge that creates a need for a change and to focus on a particular attribute. So I would say that the case studies would give an indication of what the challenges were for those utilities, why they chose to focus on the attributes that they did, and how effective the measurement piece, which is always helpful, how the improvement rolled out. Anything to add on that, Rob? Or?
No, Ed, that's right. I think, again, our best source of related information related to that question are the current case examples that we have.
All right, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Rob. We have another question. Do you do follow-up visits to see how the utility is meeting EUM new objectives / attributes?
Let me say, I'm not quite sure of the context for that question, Tori. What I would say is that when we've seen successful implementation of EUM, both the primer, the use of the primer, and of the roadmap, it's typically embedded in commitment to continual improvement, so that there's some form of annual cycle or even shorter time frame cycle of examination of performance, course corrections made. So there is this kind of notion of ongoing checking in within the utility in order to spur forward. Ed also mentioned the notion of a champion, and we'll actually be releasing a case example in the near future of Austin Water that has done a very deep implementation of EUM. And one of the things that they did, they selected 4 attributes for their focus. They created teams for each of those attributes and a lead or champion. And again, it appears that they've had some, really effective implementation through that model.
Right. You know, one of the things I think that that makes this such a helpful process is that as a utility, it's pretty straightforward, and you don't need. I mean, some utilities choose to, but you don't really need to hire an outside consultant to facilitate this. This is something you can do within your organization. Having said that, when we do these workshops, we'll typically we'll say, hey, if you ever have any questions or, some sticking point, feel free to give a call. So I think that would reflect almost anybody engaged in helping to put together the roadmap and the effective utility management process. You'll see a list of probably close to 20 utility leaders that these are all folks that were involved in helping to develop these processes, as well as Jim Horn over at EPA. So don't be shy. If there's a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to any of us. But in general, the way the whole process has been set up in the documents, like the primer and the roadmap in all, it's pretty easy to implement this internally within the organization, and it's not something that you necessarily need outside, external consultation for. But certainly, having said that, also don't forget some of your best sources of information are your peers, and those of you that network on a regular basis with your peers will probably find that that's as helpful as any other approach.
All right, thank you. Our next question that we have either of you had experience with smaller systems that are struggling with level 1, i.e. operating and staying in compliance? Any advice you have here to help them work into higher levels? Typically, the challenge here is usually financial. And so the first part of that question, I realized it's a two-part question. Have either of you had experience with smaller systems that are struggling with level 1, which is operating and staying in compliance?
Yeah, I'll take a first pass at that. Yeah, I do. In fact, I was an interim general manager at a small utility that had its challenges in a number of the attribute areas at even operating at the level 1. And a lot of times what it really comes down to is it's not, you can't flip a switch, but it's actually working on the organizational culture and having clear expectations. And oftentimes it may be something we're engaging with very clear strategic goals, followed up with training across the organization. So if your organization is not yet a small utility, but not yet at a level 1, oftentimes I know my opinion is that the vast majority of organizations, that finances don't stand in the way of becoming a good, solid level 1 small utility. Oftentimes it's the ability to have a culture in place, which of course also means being able to attract and retain great people. Because if you've got great people, you can do anything in an organization. But small utilities sometimes are more challenged to be able to attract great people. But the more an organization focuses on clear strategic goals and puts its energy and resources towards accomplishing those, I think that's a great place to start.
Tori, this is Rob. I'll just add, I just want to note that EPA, in partnership with USDA, has a companion document to the EUM primer. It's very similar in structure, but geared towards small systems. EPA and USDA have also partnered in the past to run workshops for small systems. Those workshops have primarily been delivered by some of the national associations that focus on providing technical assistance to small systems. one of the things that I experienced through providing support and sitting in on several of those workshops over time was really stressing that once the self-assessment is done by the small utility, that laying out a very incremental, stepwise approach to improvement, recognizing that the capacity for change can be much more constrained as you get to smaller and smaller utilities where individuals wear multiple hats and maybe primarily in a more reactive rather than proactive mode. So there's just, the capacity challenges can be different within that context. So that there was a real emphasis in those workshops and among the peers that came together with small systems. It's like, pick your one thing that you feel like you really need to be doing, get those things prioritized and don't take on too many all at once.
Right. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Rob. Speaking to some other challenges, can you speak to the challenges that utilities could face due to a lack of leadership continuity?
So Ed, do you want to take that first, and then I have some thoughts as well?
This has been happening, all around, not just the country, around the world. As, for example, baby boomers have moved from organizations into retirement or into becoming consultants or whatever that may be. This continuity issue is an important one. It's so important that when we updated the effective utility management, we actually changed one of the 5 keys of management success and replaced one with knowledge management. Becomes pretty important, the knowledge management piece. But I think the key here for an organization is to be growing your own, whether it's bringing in operators and training and moving them up in the area of operations, or whether it's focusing on developing your staff, developing your employees, recognizing that the job of a leader is to create more leaders, not to create followers, right? And so I think it becomes it's a very smooth transition when an organization loses some of its key people, whether they be at the top or somewhere in the middle of the food chain, or even some very critical folks that are at the staff level. But if we've been doing a job as leaders, at every level in the organization, we've been developing people to replace us. So that's, I think, if nothing else, the recognition, incorporating it right into the performance plans of every manager, supervisor in an organization, of developing their people. I think that's a part of the key for it to go smoothly. So that as organizations, I know my organization, East Bay Municipal Utility District, just selected its next general manager. And like the previous 2, it was an internal candidate. What that allows is somebody that understands the culture, that's been there, perhaps even been spiraled through different parts of the organization to oversee operations or engineering, or even the human resources area. Over the course of time, you've got the DNA in place to replace anybody that leaves an organization and be successful. Would you like to follow up on that one, Rob?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. I guess the one thing that I would add here is part of the concept of both the EUM primer and the roadmap is that if a utility is able to systematically and systemically embed a continual improvement management process built around EUM, that the utility itself can become more resilient to changes in leadership. Again, because you've got a well-functioning continual improvement system that can sort of outlive any individual. So that's part of the concept. I think it's the concept in general of continual improvement systems, is that they hopefully make organizations less dependent on any one individual leader and more on a team of individuals embedded in and engaging in the continual improvement process.
All right, thank you. Our next question that we have, the EUM looks like it sets a great base for an ISO standard. Does it follow a particular one? Example of ISO 24511 or ISO 14001.
Tori, this is Rob. I can take that on first. So certainly the EUM, when the EUM primer was being formulated, and the roadmap as well, there was an awareness and attention to the various ISO standards and the continual improvement programs that they represented. And so definitely the ability to sort of buckle EUM into various ISO programs is there. You'll find in particular one of the case examples. This is the Palm Bay Utilities example. Palm Bay was was both ISO 14001 certified and ISO 9000 certified, and so in their case example, in terms of their use of their roadmap, they docked the roadmap with both of those processes and developed a dashboard that was designed to speak to them in an integrated fashion as well. So again, very much there is definitely a fairly straightforward way to dock those.
And Rob, before we continue, we did have a question of what does ISO mean?
Yeah, so the ISO is the International Standards Organization. It's an organization that prepares standards that apply, at least in part, in the context of various sectors. Within the water sector, ISO 14001, which is an environmental management system standard, has been looked at and adopted by utilities around the country. So again, you can, if you Google up, International Standards Organization, you'll get the full details of their programs and initiatives. And if you want to add anything on ISO there, but I think I kind of got the high level description on target.
Yeah, no, Rob, I think you got it covered. Certainly, the EUM was informed by and done with the knowledge of how ISO programs work, but it does all kind of boil back down to that whole plan, do, check, act approach.
All right, thank you. And the next one we have, someone mentioned, this presentation seems to describe organizational management as in strategic planning and SWOT analysis. Can this be adopted for any organization?
So again, Tori, I'll go ahead and start. Ed, if you want to fill in behind me. The answer is yes. So the concept of the EUM primer, and then I also mentioned previously the small systems assessment guide, which is also built around the concept of the attributes and keys to management success, are designed to support a strategic planning effort, and very much is asking for utilities. The term SWOT is not used, but you'll absolutely see that you're essentially looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, with an emphasis in the EUM on the strengths and weaknesses, so that more internal look, at how the organization is doing. I think of the OT part, opportunities and threats of a SWOT analysis, as a more, sort of external landscape review. And there's less emphasis on that in the context of EUM. It's more an internally focused self-assessment that takes place. But it is designed to support strategic planning, or even be the strategic planning that an organization may undertake. And again, we've seen utilities of all sizes in these workshops that I mentioned with small systems. We had utilities down to 100 connections in these workshops, and then all the way up to utilities that have very large service areas and huge customer bases. Anything you want to add there?
I think you hit the bullseye, Rob.
All right, thank you, Rob. And someone mentioned, based on that previous question, on the topic of proactive versus reactive improvements, is there any study or just your experience with proactive spending money to improve wastewater/water systems, or versus reactively spending it?
I think.
Yeah, Ed, go ahead.
I was going to say that my experience has been that the studies are out there that show how much more expensive it is to say go out, not to mention impacts on your organization's reputation in the community. If you're pulling a vehicle out of a sinkhole because you decided, well, let's just wait until something fails and then fix it, as opposed to proactively keeping track of the condition that your infrastructure is in. And it's just a lot more expensive for that catastrophic failure, both in terms of the financial cost to fix it versus what it would have cost to replace a sectional line or run CIPP through it. But the greatest cost, frankly, is the cost to an organization's reputation, because nothing's more important than that in your community. But I can't just tell you right off the top of my head where the studies are. But generally speaking, there are some things that are fine to run to failure, not if it's critical infrastructure, and probably 15%, on average, about 15% of your infrastructure is critical to where it cannot fail without having a significant impact on your operation. There are some things that you can run to failure, but for the most part, things such as collection systems are things that you want to stay on top of. And if you get an average 50-year, say, life to your collection system, for sections of your collection system, you want to be generally replacing at least 2% of it, so that over the course of the 50 years you have replaced it, as opposed to letting it go. We all see stories about 100-year, 150-year-old sewer lines, brick sewer and whatnot, falling apart. So in general, I think it's pretty much accepted in the water sector that the majority of your infrastructure, you want to be proactively keeping track of the condition and proactively replacing it while there's still some amount of service life. You don't want to be waiting till you're down to 2 years of service life remaining on something before you move ahead to replace it.
All right, thank you both. And someone mentioned, measurement is always a challenge. So their question is, how is this data collected? Or, what are some tips for data collection for this self-assessment process?
Ed, do you have thoughts on that one?
Well, a lot of utilities. We hear a lot about intelligent and smart water systems. A lot of this data can be collected automatically, via SCADA systems and that kind of thing. And more we're starting to see that approach. Other organizations are manually collecting data, but some of these things are fairly straightforward. Let's say, for example, that you've got as a target goal of having, zero violations of your NPDES permit. Becomes pretty straightforward, easy for something like that. When it comes to be collecting data on something more along the lines of your employee turnover, something like that, a little more challenging, but not so. But it really depends on the attribute and the practice. But I'd say is more and more what I'm seeing in the industry is more automation to where you're using smart systems to do that work for you.
All right, thank you, Ed. And our last question that we have today before we move on to the closing poll and towards the end of the webinar, the last question that we have, are any of the case studies small systems, or kind of what is the range of utilities that have been examined?
Yes, I could take a pass at that. The one, what I would consider a small utility in across the 5 case studies is Greenwood Metropolitan District in South Carolina. Their service population is roughly 50,000. So I venture to guess, not having the case study right in front of me, but it's certainly well under 10 MGD, perhaps under 5 MGD utility. But certainly ranging up to larger utilities. Clean water services probably on the order of 50 plus, 50 to 80 MGD, and Green Bay somewhere in between, more of a mid-size. Greenwood is probably the closest to what in California a utility with a population of 50,000 would be considered small, whereas it might actually be considered large in a couple of the states. So it all is relative. But Greenwood is probably the case study to look at. If you're a utility with less than 100,000 population, you want to see, what practices they chose to put in place.
All right, thank you so much, Ed. And as Ed mentioned, I will try to send out those case examples as well, along with the webinar recording and the copy of the slides. But thank you all for submitting your questions. We hope that this Q&A session has been helpful for all of you. And also thank you for staying on. Kind of the last minute or two that we have here, we will be doing another EUM webinar in the next couple months. And obviously we want to be sure that we're giving you the best possible information. So our closing poll, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best score, 1 being the worst, how would you rate today's webinar? And if you aren't seeing the polling window on your screen, you can also chat that in as well. And we'll give people a couple more seconds. And we'll close it in 5 seconds. All right, thank you so much. And then the last thing that we have, for future EUM webinars, what changes do you recommend, if any? And again, you can put that in the chat box. And as people are typing those in, I just wanted to, thank everyone for taking time out of your hectic schedules to learn more about the Effective Utility Management Roadmap. I know that with everyone, operations have been just a little far from normal. So we hope that this was informative, and we thank you for your time. If you had colleagues who were unable to listen in today, we're hosting another EUM Roadmap webinar on August 18th. I'll be sending out flyers in the coming months, notifying people of that. And if you are interested, we have another webinar next week with the topic of utility workforce diversity programs on Tuesday, June 23rd. And we'll have speakers from Saco Wastewater Resource Recovery Department and the Metropolitan Council of Environmental Services in the Twin Cities. So we hope that you can all join us. Following this webinar, I will be sending out a copy of the webinar slides for your reference, so you didn't have to copy down all the information as quickly as possible. And I'll also be sending out the webinar recording so you can listen to it. And if you have colleagues that want to, watch the recording, we can do that. They can do that as well. And I'll be sending out a couple bits of information, including the roadmap case examples. But thank you so much for your time today. And I didn't know if Jim, Rob, or Ed had any other items, but thank you so much for joining us.
Just wanted to thank you all. I hope that you all benefit from this webinar.
All right, thank you everyone. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and be on the lookout for an email from me. All right, thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks, Tori.